All right, so in the second of our introductory science and social science videos, we're going to think about how do we use theory and data to come up with patterns of reasoning and explaining things about the world. Because there are different ways we do this which tend to rely on different scientific research designs or research methods, as they're often called. I'm going to apologize up front for this first series of slide lectures being rather visually dull. I wanted to get these out, but I will make the others a little bit more visually interesting and not gray, like literally gray the entire time. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways of going about reasoning, which we call deductive and inductive. Most of us are kind of familiar with the idea of deducing something. We hear this a lot, and it's like, well, I merely deduced from the evidence. What's interesting, we'll get into what that means in a bit, is that that's actually not what deductive reasoning means. The key distinction here is between when do we have a theory, when do we go out and get data and observations about it, and what's the relation between those two things. In deductive reasoning, we begin with a theory. We begin with our ideas about the way the world is. If, for example, if poverty exists everywhere, then poverty must serve a purpose. Or if we get into the Davis-Moore, going back to their hypothesis, if inequality in society serves to motivate people to do the hardest jobs, then the hardest jobs would be paid more. Now that's something I can go out and research. It's a very concrete statement, right? And that's what we call, that's a hypothesis, right? We didn't start with observation, or we had some general observation, but I'm starting with a theory, and then I go out and I look at jobs and how much they pay. And I'm either going to confirm my hypothesis, and if I find that the hardest jobs do pay more, or I'm going to disprove it, and I find out that teachers get crap pay, and it's a really, really hard job. So I'm like, well, I guess I need to revise my theory. The opposite of this is inductive reasoning, and this is a more gradual process. It's a less top-down. We actually start with data. And this is why inductive reasoning tends to be a bit more exploratory. We kind of start poking around in the world and then develop theory. And this is what we call an iterative process. It goes over and over again. We start with little data, develop a theory, get a little more data. So one of the research examples was a woman researching how couples viewed the female companion working in the household or not working in the household, and whether they thought it was sort of legitimate work or whether it was just something she did to kind of keep herself occupied. So then she started getting some data, and the researcher found that couples from different class backgrounds, and particularly poor and working class couples, tended to have different attitudes towards this. They saw it absolutely necessary as both people having a job. So then this is a development of a theory that in more working class families or households, the attitudes towards women working is different than upper class households. But then she needed to go get more data, so she recruited more working class couples to her study and continued to develop her theory. Right? So she had some data, she developed a theory, she got more data, more theory. It's a bit more of a kind of a circular process. In general, as we'll see, deductive reasoning tends to benefit more what we'll call quantitative methods. We'll get into what those are a good bit more later on. But generally, they're more kind of upfront. They're more top-heavy. And what I mean by that is, if you think about a survey, for example, a big long questionnaire, you have to have all your questions and all the answer options already done before you send out that survey. So there's a lot more work up front, but since you have a theory and you know what you want to prove or disprove, you send it out, and then once you get it back, people answer the way you think they do, then you've either proved it or disproved it, or confirmed or disproved. With inductive reasoning, it's very different. We often begin by simply asking people open-ended questions or observing behavior, and then start to develop theories that explain that behavior and the patterns we see out of it. So one of the videos we will be viewing in addition to this will be a little clip from a new Sherlock Holmes series. And this is a good example of deductive reasoning, or pardon me, inductive reasoning. And what's interesting is Sherlock Holmes is fairly famous for saying, "I merely deduced from the evidence," if any of you are familiar with Sherlock Holmes. The famous case of the dog that didn't bark in the night is one great example. So in this little case of his, there was a body that was found murdered, and the police suspect a person that the victim doesn't know. And Sherlock Holmes comes up with this theory that there's a problem with that because the dog didn't bark in the night. And his reasoning, again, he has this data at the beginning that the dog didn't bark. And he says, well, if dogs bark at people they don't know, and the dog did not bark in the night, then the murderer must have been known to the victim. If the dog had not known the person, as the police suspected, then he would have barked them. So what Holmes is actually doing here is starting with evidence. And if you've ever watched or read Sherlock Holmes, what he does is he observes lots of details about people, and then he comes up with an explanation. And this is inductive reasoning. He starts with data and then comes up with a theory, even though he constantly says he's deducing. Some of the issues we're going to be looking at throughout this course, particularly with social sciences, what we call the Hawthorne effect, which is a fancy way of saying, what happens when you know someone is watching you and researching you? Do you behave differently? And this is important because a lot of the time we're claiming that what our social science proves is how people behave in the real world. But if, me sitting there with a magnifying glass looking at you changes your behavior, then maybe I'm really just researching what people are like when they're being researched. Reliability and validity are also key issues. Reliability simply boils down to how likely is it a study that we conduct can be repeated. That if we go to a particular cafe, that we're going to see the same patterns of behavior day after day. Likely we will, but we need to be sure that our findings are reliable. And validity concerns with the idea that we're actually measuring what we say we are about the world. If I say I'm measuring attitudes about race, how valid is that? Am I really getting people's attitudes about race? Or are they, most people don't want to be racist, or at least they say so. Am I really measuring their judgments, their fear of me judging them as being racist, or am I actually measuring their concerns? And finally, ethical concerns. I'll spend a whole week on this, but thinking about the morals of researching human beings. This is very different than looking at patterns in rocks. And we have to think about things like, are we harming the people we're researching? Are we disempowering them? Are we listening to their voices? Are they benefiting from our research? These are all concerns we'll explore throughout this course. All right, in our discussion this week, we'll look a bit more at the question of peer review and go through the general scientific process. Peer review is kind of the end part, the publishing of research, and there are some real problems with it. And we need to think about science as a very practical project. Think about who funds it, who pays for it, how does it get done. This is a big issue in our current pandemic environment. Much of the research being done is for profit. How does that change the way the science is done? So these are all ethical concerns that we're gonna bring up a lot more in our in-person discussion this week on Thursday.